Okay, it looks like people are making their way in, so we can start. I am Audrey Keenan, a project coordinator with the National Environmental Health Association. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on EPA's research on PFAS. Just to give you some background on this webinar series, NEHA and EPA have been partnering together for the past 2 years to collaborate and promote each other's work, along with producing a quarterly webinar series. Today's webinar will cover EPA's PFAS action plan in progress and discuss some research and development. And I just want to go over a couple of items before we begin. First, we are recording this webinar today, and the recording will be posted on NEHA's webpage as well as through EPA's media channels as well. The second thing is that all of the webinar participants are in listen-only mode, so you aren't able to speak. So please use the chat box for any questions you have throughout the presentation. And we will have time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A session, and we'll answer your questions from the chat box then. And with that, I'll hand it over to Bailey Stearns from the EPA Office of Science, Communication, and Engagement, who is going to introduce our speaker for us today.
Hi everyone, I'm Bailey Stearns with EPA's Office of Research and Development. Our speaker today is Dr. Andy Gillespie. Andy is a forester and statistician by training. He spent the first half of his federal career with the U.S. Forest Service, eventually serving as the leader of the nation's forest census program. He came to our Office of Research and Development in 2004 as a division director in the National Center for Environmental Assessment, and then served as the Deputy Lab Director at our National Risk Management Research Laboratory. He is now an Associate Director in our Center for Environmental Measurement and Modeling. Thanks for joining us, Andy, and thank you for the introduction, Audrey. I'll now pass it over to Andy for his presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Bailey and Audrey. Are you able to hear me and see my slide okay?
Yep, everything looks good.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us today. As Bailey just mentioned, I'm the Associate Director for one of EPA's research centers, but for the last 3 years, I've also been serving in another role as the executive lead for all of the PFAS-related research that EPA's Office of Research is doing. So I get to work with all of the different parts of the EPA's research program. I also get to work with the program offices and regional offices of EPA, and through them with a lot of our stakeholders. So it's been a very interesting place to be for a few years, looking at the science that we're doing to try to support good decision-making about PFAS. So I'm going to give a quick overview today of the research that we're doing on PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So just as a little bit of background, in case some other people on the call aren't familiar with this class of chemicals, it's a very large class of entirely synthetic chemicals. These chemicals don't occur in nature. They all start their lives somewhere in a chemical manufacturing facility. There's something in the order of 5,000 or 6,000 chemicals globally that are known right now in this PFAS class, plus a number of unknown PFAS chemicals that represent various degradation products or breakdown byproducts from the production process. Of that large number, there's about 1,200 that have been registered in the US for use at some point in time, and about half of those are still active on the TSCA inventory. So about 600 PFAS that have been produced or used in the last 10 years. But all PFAS chemicals have in common some component of the molecule which consists of a chain of carbon atoms. And if you can see my mouse here, these black circles in these diagrams represent the carbon atoms. And they're surrounded, the carbon atoms are surrounded by fluorine atoms, either entirely or for the most part. Such that the chain length can vary, but every PFAS molecule has some component of a carbon chain surrounded by fluorine. These diagrams are two of the more common and best known PFAS, the ones that have been around the longest, PFOA on the left, PFOS on the right. These relatively simple types of molecules have the carbon chain with some kind of functional head at one end, but the chemistry can get very complex, and there's many other shapes and configurations that these molecules take. And that matters because it makes a very complicated chemistry with thousands of different variations. And because of that, these can be tailored for many different uses, either in industrial processes to make things or in actual consumer products, things that people would buy and use. Some of the concerns we have about this class of chemicals is that we know that they're mobile. They can move through the air. They can move through water pathways. Some of them can. And at least some of them are known to be what we call PBT. So they're persistent in the environment. This carbon-fluorine bond is very strong and can last on the order of centuries to thousands of years before it breaks down naturally in the environment. Some of them are also known to be bioaccumulative in organisms. And so in other words, when an organism takes this molecule into its system, the molecule can persist. It can stay in the body for some period of time. It doesn't just pass quickly through. And so the dosage, the internal dose, can actually build up even when there's a steady state of external dose. And some of them are known to be toxic at relatively low levels. We're talking part per trillion levels. They cause a variety of adverse health effects. We know that there's been some data, some chemicals have shown things like liver effects, kidney effects, thyroid effects, different kinds of cancer, cholesterol. Recent information has shown the potential for things like reducing immunoresponses. So a lot of different potential adverse outpoints for at least some of these chemicals. By way of background, the PFAS class has been around since the 1940s. Initially, it was a relatively small number of chemicals that were used in things like Scotchgard and Teflon and anything that you wanted to be stain resistant or stick proof. But the diversity of the chemicals has gone well beyond that in recent years. Pretty much everybody, certainly in the US and around the planet, have been exposed to PFAS. And most of us have some level of these chemicals in our body. Recent surveys, such as the NHANES National Survey, has documented the amount of certain compounds of PFAS that have been found in human bodies and in Americans. And we know that roughly maybe 98% of the population has a measurable burden of at least some of these chemicals, although the amounts for some of them have been going down over time. As PFOA and PFOS have been phased out of production in the US, the production levels are much less than they used to be, and so they've been replaced with other PFAS chemicals, but the burdens of those particular chemicals in the body are going down. So there's evidence that exposure to certain PFAS may lead to adverse health effects, and because of these different attributes, it's an issue of high and growing concern for a lot of EPA customers and the public that we serve. And so EPA has been spending a lot of time on these chemicals the last few years, trying to take action that we need to support good decision making. In May of 2018, the administrator convened a national leadership summit, bringing together states, tribes, different external stakeholders to spend a couple days talking about problems that they were having, actions that we might undertake, sharing information about the PFAS concerns. That led to a series of decisions at that summit. So EPA committed to develop groundwater cleanup recommendations for PFOA, PFOS. That's been completed by our Office of Land Emergency Management. The agency is still examining options for listing PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. And we've been making progress on some toxicity assessments for 2 of these chemicals, for Gen X and PFBS. And I'll talk more about those in a little bit here. After the summit, EPA held a series of community listening events from June to September of 2018, a series of 6 public meetings to hear about the public concern about PFAS. And that was followed by a public comment period, and all of that information fed into the development of an EPA PFAS action plan, which was released in February of 2019. If you're interested, you can go to the EPA PFAS website and download the plan. There's been an update in February of this year on progress made since the initial plan was put out. But the action plan was developed on a lot of this feedback, 120,000 different comments submitted to the public docket. I was part of the team that helped write that plan. I led the writing for the research section. And I've worked with EPA for about 16 years now on many different projects, but this is the first one that I would say truly was a multimedia, multi-program national research and management effort, a very well integrated effort to address a very large and complex problem. So I spent a lot of time working with my colleagues in the Office of Water, Office of Land, Office of Chemical Safety, and with our regional colleagues to develop a plan that we think would address all of the different information needs to take action on PFAS. And so the part that I'm most responsible for, the research, we really think of it as the scientific foundation for understanding and managing risk from PFAS. There's lots of different other factors that go into making good decisions about policy and regulation and risk management, but the science is really what supports a lot of that, to give the information needed to understand trade-offs, to understand what's effective and what's not effective. Many of you that have followed EPA research for many years may know that we often organize complex problems using what we call the risk paradigm. So we take a large complex problem like PFAS and we break it down into components to make it more manageable. And we've done that in the case of PFAS. So when I first came in to take over this role as executive lead a few years ago, At the time, EPA was doing research on PFAS, but PFAS was really just one of many chemical sets that we were working on. There wasn't an integrated, organized research plan around PFAS itself. And so one of the first things I did was to try to identify what we were doing, identify what the gaps were, using this risk paradigm to make sure that we were addressing the full array of science that would be needed, both to identify and prioritize risks, and then to take action to address those risks. And so the way we organize the research is we want to understand toxicity. What's the dose-response relationship between different PFAS chemicals and potential adverse effects, both in humans and in ecosystems. We want to understand the exposure. How are people and ecosystems being exposed to these chemicals? And how are the chemicals moving through the environment and translating into some kind of a dose? Once you have that information, you can understand the risk. You can begin to prioritize and figure out which are the potential exposures that might be the most harmful. And then you can plan treatment remediation actions to break that exposure, to do something to prevent any kind of an adverse effect. And so that's the risk paradigm in brief, and that's really how we've organized our science. This next slide, number 7, talks about some of the recent advances that we've made in PFAS science in the past few years. And so EPA has updated one method and developed a second method, analytical method for measuring PFAS in drinking water. Method 537.1 has been around for a few years. We updated that last year to add 4 additional PFAS. And then method 533 came out earlier this year for a somewhat different set of PFAS. Method 533 focuses on more of what we call the shorter chains, PFAS molecules with 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 carbon atoms, whereas 537 tended to focus on longer chains, 6, 7, 8, and up. So there's some overlap between the two methods. Between the two of them, we have 29 different PFAS that we can quantify in drinking water. We have a draft method, 8327, which is going to be hopefully finalized in the next few months. It's been through a multi-lab validation. And that one focuses on non-drinking water, non-potable water. So things like surface water, groundwater, wastewater, and some of the related solids like biosolids and sediments. And this one covers 24 different PFAS chemicals. The first one, 8327, is what we call a direct injection method. And we're developing a sort of a sister method to that under the Clean Water Act, a method 1600 series, which will use a direct injection, an isotope dilution approach, which is preferred by many laboratories and by some of our partners, such as Department of Defense. But eventually, both of those methods will be multi-lab validated and will be available for measuring PFAS in non-potable water. We've done a lot of research in recent years on using high-resolution mass spectrometry to discover unknown PFAS. So unlike methods like 533 or 8327, where you have a list of analytes, non-targeted analysis allows you to discover PFAS that you don't know are in your sample. And working back, we can try to figure out what the chemistry is and use this to discover some of the novel PFAS that we're not yet aware are even in the environment. We also have analytical methods, what we call research level methods. So these have not been through a multi-lab validation, but they have been published in scientific studies for quantifying PFAS in blood serum and estuarine waters. A few years ago, we started developing an actual physical collection, a PFAS library of 430 different reference samples to support research. We wanted to do a variety of different studies on PFAS. We wanted to make sure that we were studying the same chemicals in different lines of work. And so we built up a collection. It's been through procurement, through some of our standard companies that sell us analytical standards for different kinds of analyses. And that set is up to 430 different specimens right now. We've got some online databases that are available. So there's a HERO database for human toxicity literature that has citations for 32 different PFAS chemicals. You can go on our EPA website and get access to HERO to get that information. And the EcoTox knowledge base, for those of you that work in ecotoxicology, currently has about 19,000 records that address 459 species and 130 different PFAS chemicals. And this is something that we're adding to every quarter. We continuously search the literature and try to keep that up to date. More on the risk management end, we've got a drinking water treatability database that EPA has maintained for many years. This is a database of the effectiveness of different drinking water treatment approaches on different chemical contaminants of interest. And so we've started building data on PFAS into that set. We're up to 26 different PFAS now. If you're interested in knowing how to treat drinking water in a particular location, you can go there to find out what kinds of treatments do and don't work. We've started some work actually testing some what we call point of entry water filters. These would be water filters that you would install outside of a house, you know, for the water inline that's coming in from a water supply to remove different PFAS. We'll be testing, the first ones looked at granular activated carbon, which we call GAC. We're doing some tests right now of some ion exchange resin point of entry water filters. And then technical assistance. We do a lot of work, mostly with states who come to us with different questions, different challenges based on their local conditions. Often they ask us for help with sampling or analysis of PFAS. Sometimes we've done some work helping states try to identify sources, doing some fingerprinting, a variety of different kind of projects. I'll talk about more about that in a little bit here. So the next series of slides is going to walk you through at a high level what I call the different lines of work, the different sort of groups of research that we're doing right now. This first one focuses on analytical methods. So it's the data gap here is having a collection of standardized and validated methods for measuring PFAS in different environmental media of interest. So I talked already about the methods that we've developed for drinking water and for non-potable water. Those were two of the earliest needs that were made aware of to EPA. But we know that PFAS can move through other media as well. And so we're developing right now methods for sampling and analyzing PFAS in air emissions. We know that PFAS will move up a stack in a manufacturing facility into the atmosphere. We know that different disposal incineration operations may well be putting PFAS into the atmosphere. We don't have methods yet to identify and quantify how much PFAS goes through that route. And so we've done some work to develop and adapt some of our existing emission sampling methods for PFAS. And hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have a method out which has been through some actual field tests for people that want to try to sample stack emissions. I mentioned already the isotope dilution method for 24 PFAS in different water matrices. That should be done, that should be available by the end of next year. We're looking at a method for what we call total organic fluorine. So this would be, you could think of this as a litmus test. Rather than trying to discriminate which PFAS you have in a sample, this would simply tell you yes or no whether you have PFAS in a sample. And we believe we could use this as a screening approach, processing a large number of samples to figure out which ones needed further analysis to go through the more expensive process of figuring out which PFAS and how much quantities there were. And then underlying all of this is the non-targeted research, which I talked about, using high-resolution mass spectrometry to further characterize and identify novel PFAS in the environment. And so the goal of this research is to provide a suite, a toolbox of different analytical methods that people, the stakeholders could use to measure PFAS in different environmental media of interest. We're actually doing a lot of research in this area that we call chemical data curation. So the challenge here is that there's so many PFAS, 5,000 to 6,000 globally, hundreds that we know are commercially made in the US, and probably maybe hundreds more of degradation or byproducts. It just generates a huge amount of information. So we're actually doing some work trying to develop and build some of our chemical data curation systems so that we can manage and process and analyze these data. We're developing databases and tools to streamline access so that people outside of EPA can get access to the information that we have. So some of the near-term research products, we're developing some models to predict PFAS chemical physical properties using what we call our chemical transformation simulator and some of the other simulators that go into that. We're developing a public repository for some high throughput toxicity and toxicokinetic data, which we're generating right now using some of our high throughput analytical methods. We want to make this information available out to people in the public that know how to use that kind of data. A lot of this information will be put into our chemicals dashboard, the CompTox chemistry dashboard, which EPA curates, or the ecotox knowledge base to the extent that we're doing studies on ecotoxicology. And the goal here is to put this information out in a format which is easy to search and easy for other people to find and take advantage of. The next line of research has to do with exposure. So exposure has to do with knowledge on the nature, the sources, the extent, the fate and transport, and eventually bioaccumulation, and ultimately human and ecological exposures. What's the dose that people are being exposed to of these different chemicals, and what are the pathways by which it moves through the environment? So the action here is to develop and test methods and models and databases to help characterize the sources and ultimately to predict the human and ecological exposures. EPA has done a lot of research over the years on exposure in general, chemical exposure. And so we're trying to take that expertise, that knowledge, and some of those models and tools and parameterize them so that they can be specifically applicable to PFAS, which can be a challenging class of chemicals to work with. Some PFAS have properties that are very different from a lot of the properties that we've worked with in the past with other chemicals. Some of the near-term research products here, we're working on a case study of PFAS fate and transport via air dispersion. There should be a paper on that coming out in the next few months. We're developing a framework for comparative PFAS exposure analysis that should be out by next year. And a near-term, more of an integrated product will be a multimedia human exposure assessment for 6 different PFAS chemicals. And we're aiming to get that done by the end of next year. The goal of this information is to basically enable stakeholders to identify and assess which potential PFAS in their situation are the greatest pathways to provide the greatest pathways for potential risk, so that they can focus risk management activities on the place where it'll have the most impact. So the next slide talks about human health assessment. When we talk about human health and toxicity of PFAS, there's really 2 different ways that we have to do the research. For a very large number of chemicals, PFAS chemicals, there's very little information or practically no information about toxicity. For a small set of chemicals that have been better studied in the literature, there is a pretty well-established scientific body of research about dose response and about toxicity of those chemicals. And so we're breaking our research into 2 different pathways depending on which group a chemical falls in. This first slide talks about what we're doing to understand toxicity for chemicals which have a substantial body of peer-reviewed published studies. And for these chemicals, we're running them through our usual agency toxicity assessment practices. So things, if you're familiar with the IRIS program, for example, some of these chemicals are going through the IRIS process. A couple of them have gone through a somewhat different process because we had assessments already underway 2 years ago when we started this work. But they all pretty much follow a similar path. We conduct a systematic review, evidence mapping, looking at the PFAS human toxicology literature. All the literature that we find gets added to that HERO database of scientific studies. And then we'll develop our standard toxicity assessments, our reference doses, reference values, where the data support that. So in the near term, EPA has been working on 2 assessments, which are almost finished. PFBS is a 4-carbon PFAS chemical. HFPO dimer acid is a 6-carbon. It's also known sometimes as Gen X. This is one which has been very well known in North Carolina, West Virginia, Ohio, and the Ohio River. These 2 assessments were underway a few years ago when EPA started focusing on PFAS, and so they got a jump start. They've already been through an external peer review. They've been through a public comment period. PFBS is a little bit farther ahead. We hope to have that finalized later this year. HFPO dimer acid is probably a little farther behind, but sometime in the next, within the next year, that one should be done as well. And then we have 5 other PFAS chemicals, which are undergoing formal IRIS assessments. And so if you follow the IRIS program, if you go to the IRIS website and look at the latest program update, you can get updated on the status of these chemicals. PFBA is a 4-carbon PFAS. PFHXA and HXS are both 6 carbons. PFDA is a 10-carbon, PFNA is a 9-carbon. And so we've got a range of PFAS chemicals from 4 carbon to 10 carbons undergoing IRIS assessments. And that's important to us because, well, for 2 reasons. First, there is a hypothesis that the toxicity of the chemical is related to the chain length. And when we have these assessments finished, we're going to have some very rigorous data points to at least look at that hypothesis and see whether we have reason to believe it or not to believe it. The second reason this is important to us is that these toxicity values can serve as anchors for other kinds of toxicity assessments, inferential assessments that we can do based on chemicals that might have somewhat similar chemical physical structures. And so the next slide, slide 12, starts to talk about some of that work. The human toxicity information for PFAS, where we have limited or no existing published studies, goes by a very separate route. We're actually doing some in-house research on this, using in vitro high throughput toxicity testing, toxicokinetic testing, to fill in gaps and to support prioritization, chemical grouping, read across, relative toxicity and mixtures assessment, a variety of things that we can do with this first approximation data that we get about biological activity. And we'll use this information to apply what we call new approach methods. So these are methods, they don't replace the other assessment methods where you have peer-reviewed studies based on animal models, oftentimes, but it's another way of making inference about the hazard and the toxicity for chemicals, and hopefully to prioritize some of them for further testing to identify which ones are potentially the most hazardous and to schedule them for an earlier round of maybe animal studies or some other higher tiered toxicity testing. So we have an experiment underway right now. We started with about 150 different PFAS chemicals. About 30 of them were just not amendable to the high throughput technology that we use, that we just couldn't run them through our different systems. So we've got about 120 PFAS, which are being run through 7 different sets of assays. And the idea is to generate biological activity data for different kinds of assays for each of those chemicals. The 150 originally were selected to represent as much of the diversity of the chemical physical universe of PFAS as we could acquire within our existing library of 430 samples. We obviously have to have a sample of these chemicals to run them through the assays. And so we looked at our library, we classified them in different ways, and we tried to get a few from each of the different classes and categories that we had to get an idea, kind of a first approximation of how the biological activity might vary according to different chemical and physical parameters. And so the idea here is once we generate this data set, which hopefully will be in the next few months, we can finish it up once we get back in the laboratory after being locked down for 6 months. We're going to have a very good initial data set to look at things like categorization and read across and bioactive dose levels to make some first approximations about toxicity for this large set of chemicals about which we have relatively little information. In addition to human tox, we're also very interested in ecological toxicity at EPA. And here the biggest near-term priority needs have to do with understanding better bioaccumulation and the ecotoxicity of PFAS of concern. So we want to make sure that we can identify what are the most sensitive taxa, the sensitive species that might be responsive to PFAS exposure, get a better feel for bioaccumulation. How do these chemicals build up in organisms and how do they work their way up through food webs as larger organisms eat smaller organisms? And ultimately, we want to provide the information base to support other parts of EPA that are in the business of establishing effects, benchmarks, and thresholds, and things like aquatic life criteria. We want to do the science that helps our program office colleagues do their job of where appropriate, putting out regulations. As a part of doing this, we're also looking at what we call adverse outcome pathways to provide a basis for prediction of ecological effects for poorly tested PFAS. So you can think of an adverse outcome pathway as a conceptual model for how a molecule impacts an organism at the molecular level, at the cellular level, how those effects kind of cascade through the organism and ultimately turn into some kind of an adverse outcome. If we can identify credible and functional adverse outcome pathways, then as we find other chemicals which cause the same initial molecular triggering event, we have some confidence that they might result in the same cascade of effects and the same adverse outcome. And so we can use this to do some predictive ecotoxicity analysis. Where we are right now is doing a review and a synthesis of the PFAS bioaccumulation literature, looking at how the literature supports or helps us to reparameterize some of our existing bioaccumulation models so that we can make predictions about bioaccumulation factors, focusing first on aquatic species. And we're also starting some initial work looking at these adverse outcome pathways for a few different fairly well-studied cases, PPAR signaling in fish, thyroid and avian. One interesting thing about these adverse outcome pathways is they are often conserved across species. So sometimes information about human AOPs can be used to make inferences about ecological and vice versa. So the goal here is to just provide stakeholders with as much PFAS ecotoxicity information as we can to support some of those risk management decisions, both the literature information as well as some of our modeling capabilities. So everything I've talked about up to this point has been largely focused on the risk assessment, risk prioritization side. The next few slides talk about the research that we're doing on risk management. What do you do when you actually have a PFAS problem that you've identified, that you prioritized and you're trying to solve on the ground? So this first slide talks about drinking water treatment research. We know that drinking water is one of the pathways by which some people in the US get exposed sometimes to some of the higher levels of PFAS which exist in the population. If your drinking water supply has been impacted, for example, by a AAAF, aqueous film forming foam contamination, which gets into the groundwater, or from the output of some kind of a factory or manufacturing facility, that can result in fairly concentrated high doses. And so drinking water treatment was one of the first things that EPA started studying and working on several years ago. Luckily, we've had for many years a very strong research center in Cincinnati, Ohio, which has really for many years has done a lot of the cutting edge research for drinking water treatment in the US, not just PFAS, but things like lead and copper. A lot of that information is generated out of this laboratory, and they've been focusing a lot of their efforts the last few years looking at PFAS. So what they do is they gather as much information as they can from different drinking water treatment tests and pilots and operations and facilities, aggregate that data, develop models for how to make predictions about how different PFAS behave under different conditions and how you can treat them or remove them. We also integrate the cost data because we understand the utilities have to understand the costs to make investments for these different systems, and also different range of system sizes. To the extent that there's gaps in the information, we do some pilot scale and some bench scale work to fill in those gaps to understand which treatments are more effective for which PFAS, which mixtures of PFAS, and what kinds of water conditions. Two of the more promising technologies, which are very commercially advanced right now, are granular activated carbon and ion exchange resin. So we've been focusing a lot on those because we know that they're accessible to utilities that want to install a drinking water treatment system. And we're just trying to make sure that we understand the full range of effectiveness and the operating conditions, how often you have to change out the sorbents in order to keep these functional. And because we take a life cycle approach to this work, we're interested not only in how effective the media is in removing the PFAS from the water, but then what do you do with the media once it's been fully used and has to be replaced? We don't want to just dispose of it somewhere where it causes or creates another PFAS contamination process. And so we're looking at some of the technologies that are used for regeneration or disposal of the granular carbon or the ion exchange resin once it's been used and has to be swapped out. A lot of the information from these studies goes into the drinking water treatability database, which I mentioned earlier. It's available online on our webpage. We're developing some related drinking water performance and cost models and the data to run those models so that utilities can have a tool that they can use to simulate what their alternatives and the implications of different choices might be. And then trying to get into some facilities to generate some data on the what happens to the PFAS during the reactivation of the thermal treatment process. Does it truly get destroyed, or does it go up the stack in some format? Can it be filtered out, or is it do some other additional treatment technologies have to be put into place? And the goal here is to provide utilities with the information they need to identify cost-effective treatment strategies for their particular drinking water situation. The next line of work has to do with site remediation, basically cleanup. You know, we know that there's a lot of sites across the country which have been impacted by PFAS. PFAS has been used for decades in a variety of different products, and for many years it wasn't widely understood that they couldn't cause potential long-term adverse effects in people, but also could be so durable in contaminating a particular site. And so there's a lot of sites across the country from different industries which need to be understood and characterized so that they can be cleaned up. Many of them are associated with, I mentioned before, the AFFF, the aqueous film forming foam, which is the foam that firefighters use to put out liquid fires. So things like jet fuel and gasoline fires, refineries, anytime you see them spraying the white foam, it's very likely an AFFF foam. And those foams have been, and today still are, often formulated with PFAS chemicals. But that's not the only source. We know that many different industries over the years have produced or have used PFAS in a manufacturing process. Anytime you're coating a paper or coating material, coating cloth, waterproofing things often involve PFAS chemicals. And depending on how those were handled over the decades, there's many places in the country where they were disposed of and have created some kind of a contaminated site. And so the research that we're doing, much of which is in collaboration with Department of Defense, because Department of Defense has identified many military installations where AFFF training locations have been the source of PFAS, which has gotten into the ground and the soil and the groundwater. So the research focuses on trying to characterize the source, making sure that we understand what are the PFAS that we need to clean up, and then looking at different technologies for remediating the impacted soils and the water and the sediments, generating the cost and the performance data so that the people responsible for site cleanup have the tools that they need to make optimal decisions about how to clean up a particular site. Some of the near-term research products there, we hope to have some groundwater performance and cost models and data sets available by the end of this year. We're doing some experiments looking at thermal treatment of PFAS contaminated soils. This involves a two-step method which has been used for other chemical contaminants, where you first heat up some contaminated soil to drive off the contaminants, to volatilize them. And then there's a second stage at a much higher temperature where you actually destroy the contaminants. And so the question we have is whether these existing systems can be used to also destroy PFAS chemicals, or whether some additional steps need to be taken. We're looking at PFAS fate and transport from the land application of contaminated biosolids. So we know that many PFAS waste streams, for example, landfill leachate or different industrial streams, have made their way to wastewater treatment plants, where they get mixed with biosolids that are coming out of the plant. To the extent that those biosolids get then applied to land in different places, the PFAS can move. It doesn't break down in the wastewater treatment plant, and the PFAS can wind up getting applied to the ground, contaminating the soil and the groundwater. And then to the extent that any crops are grown there, or livestock is grazed there, that PFAS can make its way back into the food supply. And so we want to understand that fate and transport pathway and figure out what needs to happen to make sure that we break that off. And then a recent project that we've gotten underway has to do with migration potential of PFAS via vapor intrusion. So vapor intrusion is a well-known phenomenon for many other pollutants. You have groundwater that carries a pollutant of some kind, and it can get into buildings just by volatilization of certain chemicals. We know that some PFAS are volatile, and to the extent that they can move through groundwater, there's a potential risk of vapor intrusion. And so we started some studies to try to look at that, to figure out how that would factor into site remediation. A lot of work is going on right now on the subject of PFAS disposal, basically understanding and managing the end-of-life process for different PFAS materials. Because these molecules are so durable, they're going to be around for a very long time. And if they're not carefully managed at the end of their life, they can just cycle through a system and they can just cause subsequent contaminations for a very long time. So we're looking at the different kinds of disposal streams that exist: municipal waste streams, industrial waste, recycled waste streams, trying to understand the efficacy of different disposal technologies. How do you go about, what's the best way to landfill PFAS contaminated waste? How do you manage the leachate? What happens when you incinerate PFAS? What are the temperatures and the holding times and the turbulence that you need to actually break apart that carbon-fluorine bond and truly destroy a PFAS molecule, as opposed to just ejecting it back into the atmosphere? Trying to understand the performance and the cost of these different material management processes to do them in a way that doesn't cause re-releases following disposal. So several different projects underway here, looking at landfills and leachates in Florida. We've got some tests underway in our laboratory under different incineration thermal treatment conditions, trying to get into some facilities to actually test some of the same kinds of experiments in actual operational facilities. And then looking at thermal treatment of some of the contaminated biosolids. Some of those are disposed of through municipal sewage incinerators. We want to make sure that we understand how effective that is. So related to the topic of treatment and disposal, 6 months ago, EPA kicked off a very focused kind of what we call a tiger team, or a skunks works kind of an operation. We call the PFAS Innovative Treatment Team. So this is a group of about a dozen scientists who were detailed to work full-time over the last 6 or so months, looking for different potential solutions for destroying or disposing PFAS molecules in different media. So they've been going through the literature, looking at different technologies which have been tested in the past, which are being tested now, trying to do some laboratory work and some field work, basically trying to expand the toolkit of different technologies that might be suitable for disposing or destroying PFAS in a permanent manner under different situations, different conditions. There might be some treatments that are more suitable for a very specialized kind of waste and others for a different kind of waste. So the idea here was to just get a group of people looking very intensively for 6 months to see what they could find as kind of a way to jump forward and make some quick progress on this challenge, which is very important to our stakeholders, of how you go about managing PFAS waste in the long run. Most of the research I've talked about is in-house research, but we do have a fair bit of extramural funding also at EPA. Two of the major areas where we provide funding is through our Safe and Sustainable Water Program. They have what they call a National Priorities Program. Last few years, they've gotten a budget mandate from Congress to spend about $4 million on water quality related work. And the last couple of years, that has been targeted on PFAS related water quality. So in 2019, it was water quality and availability. We just recently, last week, announced the winners of the 3 awards made for the 2020 competition, which is PFAS impacts on agriculture and rural communities. And then the other competitive program that EPA operates is the STAR program, Science to Achieve Results. And this last year focused, I think, about $5 million on supporting 8 different awards having to do with PFAS waste management, looking at landfills and destruction technologies. PFAS is a very broad program across government, and so there's a lot of collaboration that takes place. We work very closely at the scientist level, but also at the program management level with some of our other federal and state partners, academic communities. Some examples are listed here. The high throughput tox testing that I talked about, we do in collaboration with the National Toxicology Program. We've been working with the Food and Drug Administration and Department of Agriculture on analytical methods, trying to understand how to sample PFAS, not only in environmental media, but how that can make its way through agricultural products and into the food supply. We do a lot of work collaboratively with Department of Defense, focused largely on analytical method development, but also a lot on treatment and remediation approaches. We're active participants with them in their strategic environmental research and development program called CERTIP. And similarly, they work with us in some of our external competitive grant programs. We do a lot of work with states and public utilities, especially in applying and testing different PFAS sampling, measurement and treatment methods. And then the academic community, as I just mentioned, with the STAR program and the National Priorities Grants, those largely go to academic partners. Technical assistance is something that we get a lot of requests for because of the complexities of PFAS, the novelty. Sometimes states and tribes and communities lack some capabilities for managing the risk, and so they approach us. To the extent that we have the capacity, we're always happy to work with our partners. We'll make information available, make staff available to consult. Sometimes this leads into collaborative applied research projects. For example, we'll advise on a sampling design. A state can go out and collect samples. We can run the analysis, share the data back with them. It benefits us in terms of being a good laboratory for applied studies. It also benefits, obviously, the stakeholders who come to us looking for assistance. So it's a real win-win. I've listed a few examples here. We've got probably 15 or 20 across the country, but we've done a lot of work with the state of North Carolina, looking at discovery and identification of novel PFAS downstream of a very modern chemical manufacturing facility that makes a lot of new and novel PFAS. We've worked with New Hampshire and New Jersey, looking at some of the novel PFAS that they have and how it moves through the air and through the water. Up in the Lake States, Michigan, Minnesota, recently we've worked with them to characterize some PFAS sources in a chrome plating facility when they were having some trouble trying to understand how PFAS was making it into the waste stream. So lots of different ways that we collaborate, and to the extent that we have the sheer bandwidth for our people, we're always happy to try and do that. PFAS data and tools. This, I think, is my last slide. So this is just a link to our EPA website. If you go to epa.gov/PFAS, you can get the high-level overview of all the things that EPA is doing on the regulatory side as well as the research side. Embedded within that is a link to our research and development program, where you can find lots of resources about the projects that we have ongoing, links to the different databases that I talked about, and other information about upcoming work. And so finally, again, my name is Andy Gillespie. Feel free to contact me if you have any further questions or information you'd like to share. Be very happy to talk to anybody. And I think I'll stop there, turn it back over to Bailey and Audrey and see if there's any questions or comments.
Great, thank you, Andy. That was a great presentation, and I know I definitely learned a lot of new things, so thank you. Now we'll move on to a few questions. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll try and get through as many of these as we can. It looks like our first question is about air methods. How many PFAS would that quantify, and would any of the total organic fluorine methods work for air samples?
Good question. So with the air method, we're taking a two-pronged approach. We are going to have a targeted list of analytes, and it'll be something on the order of probably 20 to 30 things that we will look for using our targeted laboratory methods. But we're also developing methods for the non-targeted analysis. And so the non-targeted analysis, there is no list or number of analytes. With non-targeted, you basically are able to identify everything that's in a sample. You don't always know what it is, and that's the challenge, especially in an incineration environment. We expect that those processes will be generating lots of novel PFAS and other things that we're not necessarily going to recognize. But there's a lot of people across the country working on non-targeted analysis, and they share information through databases. And so it will enable us, hopefully over time, to look at the signatures and to identify more and more of the PFAS as we get. So short answer for the number is that there's no fixed number. There'll be a targeted list, but there'll also be the non-targeted capability to get everything else. The second part of the question, so the total organic fluorine, we are going to try and figure out a way to do that for the emissions. It's a lot trickier, as I understand it. I'm not a chemist, but talking to the chemist working on this, we're doing it. We're going to develop a total organic fluorine method for water, but also try to develop one for the emissions part. It's going to be very much a work in progress. And I don't have a lot of information other than to say that we're going to try and do it. We'll have a better idea probably next year of whether we'll be successful or not.
Okay, and then we have another question about the total organic fluorine test method. Will this be near real-time on-site or require taking samples to the lab?
I'm not an expert in it, but I would say almost certainly it'll require, at least initially, taking samples to a lab. I don't think, I mean, we don't, at this point, we don't even have the capability to do the targeted analysis on site in the field for things like drinking water, which I think would be the simplest challenge. It requires a mass spectrometer, a pretty expensive, large machine that has to be operated in a lab.
Okay. And then we've had a few questions about slides and recording. So just a reminder that we are recording, and both NEHA and EPA will be posting the recording on their websites. So you'll be able to access that in probably the next week or so. And then our next question for Andy is, could the TOF, I'm sorry if I said that wrong, could the TOF test method be used on site for process controls such as determining breakthrough for absorption media?
Yeah, good question. I think it's going to depend on what we finally settle on in terms of a method. As I mentioned a moment ago, I don't envision, at least in the near term, that it will be a portable method just because of the technology involved. And that's not to say we might get there eventually. I would think that would be some farther years out. You know, when I used the metaphor of a litmus test, it was really more of a metaphor intended to signify kind of a yes/no kind of a test. It's not going to be as simple as just sticking a strip into a test tube and identifying yes or no whether it's impacted by PFAS.
Okay, our next question is there a certified testing method for wastewater facilities who need to start testing for PFAS compounds?
So there's not yet what I would call a validated method, which has been finalized and published. So we're working on two methods. One is very close to being finalized. It's been through a multi-lab validation, and it would be suitable for analyzing wastewater samples. So a facility could choose to use that if they wanted to. We're probably a year farther out on the second method, the isotope dilution method, which will also be applicable to non-potable water, including wastewater samples. So in a year, well, in a few months, hopefully we'll have one method available, and then in a year we'll have a second method for people that prefer the isotope dilution approach. Now, how that translates into, I think the question was about a certified wastewater treatment plant. I don't work in the regulatory part of EPA, so I'm not sure what the requirements or the standards are for certifying states or facilities. I don't know that EPA is in that business. What we do is we put out what we call standard methods. And anybody who follows the standard method and follows the QA has produced data that EPA would recognize as validated data.
Okay, our next question. Is anything being done to regulate industries who make PFAS and hold them accountable for costs of cleanup, or even outline production as has been done for the two you mentioned at the beginning?
So there are efforts underway with an EPA. You might have heard in the last few months that our Office of Chemical Safety passed actually a couple of rules. One had to do with, and again, I'm not an expert on the regulatory side, so I might get some of the terminology wrong, but it's a SNOR, a significant new use rule, which is applicable to PFAS, and it's going to make it, it's going to put some more restrictions and notifications on industries that want to remanufacture or start reusing a PFAS. So there are some actions underway to try to get more information about what industries are doing with PFAS, which ones they're producing. There was also a recent addition to the toxic release inventory, the TRI, which is going to require companies to report on a large number, I think about 170 different PFAS chemicals. They have to report next year, but it's going to start covering this year as of January 1. So there's going to be more data about what companies are producing. In terms of regulating, so the one effort that I'm aware of right now is the internal discussion underway about whether to list these chemicals formally as hazardous substances. And if that happens, then that would open up a lot of different avenues for the potential regulation and management actions for these chemicals. But I'm not engaged in that particular process. I know the agency is committed to making a decision, yes or no, but I don't know the timeline for that or where it is. Those are probably the most relevant actions I know with respect to PFAS.
Great, thank you. Next, we have what current technologies address PFAS treatment in solids?
Treatment in what? Bailey, I'm sorry, PFAS treatment in what? I didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry, treatment in solids.
In solids. So when well, let me step back for a second. Last year, when Congress passed the authorization for the Defense Department, one of the pieces of legislation in there was directing EPA actually to develop interim guidance on the destruction and disposal of PFAS. And they listed 6 different classes of substances that we're supposed to consider, including AFFF firefighting foam, including industrial wastes, including different things that you might stack up that contain PFAS, so different kinds of solids. So I've been part of a team that's worked for about 4 or 5 months now on this interim guidance. It's going to focus on PFAS disposal and destruction. We have a draft. It's been through an interagency review. We're finalizing that right now. And the next step is a public comment step. So in September, I think September-ish is the target, there will be a public comment period on this draft document. And that will be the best opportunity in the near term for stakeholders to see what EPA's current thinking is about different technologies that are suitable for different kinds of waste streams. Now, having said that, there's still a lot of uncertainty. And so the interim guidance is going to include a section on the research that we're doing to try to reduce the uncertainty in the future and maybe make the guidance a little bit more informed going forward. But we're going to, the goal is by the end of this year to put out a first draft of what we know right now in terms of the different technologies, different approaches that are suitable for either destroying or disposing of PFAS for different kinds of materials. So just check back in a couple of months on that.
Okay, our next question is, given the health and ecological effects of PFAS and their high level of persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity, and all the issues with remediating them, why are corporations allowed to produce them and create new ones?
That's not a question I can really answer in my official capacity as an EPA researcher. The companies are following the law. Congress writes the laws, EPA implements the laws, writes the regulations, and that's the system that we have that permits those activities.
Okay. Next is, would you please go over which methods and/or analyses are being used or developed to help with grouping PFAS?
Yeah, interesting question. So this is a big topic of research for us. There's general recognition that we're never going to really be able to manage or regulate or deal with PFAS on a chemical by chemical basis. There's just too many chemicals, and the industry is very innovative. They're constantly inventing new PFAS that we don't even know are out there until we find them with non-targeting. So we are looking at different ways of grouping PFAS. When you talk about grouping, you have to talk about grouping with respect to some objective, some goal. So for example, grouping for purposes of assessing toxicity might be one goal, and you could group based on chemical or physical structure. Grouping for purposes of treatment remediation might involve a different grouping, where you group based on, I don't know, molecular weight or the commonness of some kind of part of the molecule other than the carbon fluorine part. And so we are looking at grouping. We're looking at it from several different perspectives. The research that I talked about, the high throughput tox testing with the 120 chemicals running through 8 sets of assays, we think that's going to give us some very useful information for how we might go about grouping PFAS chemicals from the perspective of human toxicity, human adverse effects. And that might be very informative for a variety of agency decisions, largely on the side of potentially coming up with rules or restrictions of certain classes of PFAS. Excuse me. For other lines of work, we're just looking at grouping different purposes. I mean, for example, analytical methods. Sometimes the analytical methods are amendable to a different set of PFAS, which have in common some kind of particular part of the molecule. So I would say that we are doing work on grouping, but the groupings may be quite different depending upon what the intended use is of that particular categorization.
Okay. Next we have, can you expand on the idea that the length of the chain is related to toxicity? Are longer chains more or less toxic?
So that is the hypothesis. That's the theory that's out there. So, years ago, for many years, PFOA and PFOS were the main PFAS being produced throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s. There were growing concerns about the toxicity in the 80s and 90s, and finally in 2000, EPA worked with 8 of the companies that were the primary manufacturers of those 2 particular molecules. They're often referred to as C8 molecules because they have 8 carbons. And EPA essentially worked out an agreement, it's called the Stewardship Agreement, with these companies to phase out the production of those 8 carbon molecules because they were concerns about the toxicity, the adverse effects. At that time, the industry agreed, those particular industry participants agreed to phase out the C8 chemistry. But of course, they still want to produce products that people can use and can buy. And so they've replaced them. And the companies do a lot of toxicology research, which is considered confidential business information. So we on the research side don't get to see it. Our partners who work in the chemical safety office, who are in charge of registering chemicals, they often have access to it. And the companies have made the case that by shortening the carbon length, the carbon chain length from 8 to 7 or 6, 6 is probably the more common one right now. And in some cases, they put other molecules in the middle of the chain. So for example, when I talk about Gen X has 6 carbons, but if you look at the chain, it's 4 carbons and then an oxygen and then 2 more carbons. And the theory being that it's a molecule that's not going to persist as a 6 carbon molecule for as long in the environment. And so based on what the companies have done, they're convinced that the shorter chain lengths are less toxic. So we, of course, are not going to necessarily take them at their word without some kind of published or peer-reviewed studies. And so lots of other researchers have done toxicity testing, looking at those chemicals. There's a vast body of literature. And so that's why we're doing the assessments. If it turns out that the toxicity of the reference dose, for example, gets higher and higher as the chain gets shorter and shorter, that would be some indication that at least for those relatively simple PFAS, there is a relationship that shorter chain lengths are less toxic. Because the higher the reference dose, that basically means that the higher the level you can be exposed to a chemical without any adverse effects. And so we'll be able to test that hypothesis, at least for that simple set, that simple class of PFAS chemicals. By no means is that going to be a comprehensive test for all possible structures, but it is one of the hypotheses that we want to look at. And it's the one that the industry has themselves say that they're convinced that there is less toxicity in the shorter chains. So we're just trying to confirm that.
Okay, and it looks like we have time for one more question. So our last question will be, given the 5,000 plus PFAS chemicals, how confident are you that the 300 or so chemicals you're focusing on will be representative of the full class of chemicals? Or how many PFAS species will eventually have to be studied and how long will that take?
Yeah, really good question. The challenge that we have is we can't just go out and buy samples of all 5,000 or 6,000. Many of those chemicals are proprietary. They're made by a single company for their own purposes. They don't tell us what the structure is. They're not available from any other source. And so even to acquire that collection of 430 took a lot of work. We bought the ones that were commercially available. In some cases, we asked our suppliers to synthesize some chemicals, which is quite expensive. I think it would be fair to say that the 430 is not necessarily representative of the whole universe of 6,000. There's very likely some very novel, very advanced chemistries out there that we're just not aware of yet. Because again, these chemical companies are very innovative around the world. Now, of course, in the US, it's a much smaller population we have to worry about. It's 1,200 that have been registered at some point, licensed for use in the US. about half of which are still active. And so we think we have a better representation of that smaller universe of 1,200. But that's also complicated by the fact that you've got these degradation products and byproducts, things that are not necessarily registered, not intended to be produced, but they get produced naturally in the environment or in production processes. And so we don't always know what the full universe of chemicals is that we're exposed to. We're going to continue to do the research, to try to discover what are these new classes of chemicals, and to the extent that we can, once we flag them and identify the structure, we can potentially flag them for some kind of procurement to add to our collection. But at this point, I would say the 430 is probably a good representation of the ones that we're aware of and the ones that we can procure, not necessarily the full set of 5,000 or 6,000. That's a much larger challenge.
Okay, thanks, Andy. And it looks like we are at the end of our hour now, so we'll wrap things up. I just want to say thank you so much to Andy and Bailey for joining us from the EPA for that great presentation. And thanks to all of our participants and for your great questions. And I hope you join us again next time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Audrey Keenan. I'm with the National Environmental Health Association. And that's all we have today. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.